We'll move now to the final talk for the first session, and it's by Dr. Andrea Nicholson, Engaged Network co-investigator and Senior Research Fellow at the Rights Lab, University of Nottingham. Dr. Nicholson's talk will be entitled, "What about the humanitarian heritage of displaced, enslaved, and vulnerable individuals?" Andrea Nicholson is a Nottingham Research Fellow in the Rights Lab and with the School of Politics and International Relations. She joined Nottingham in 2017 as an associate and later as a research fellow, having previously worked at Nottingham Trinity University as a head of department and as a research director for Nottingham Law School. She received her PhD in American Canadian Studies and History from the University of Nottingham. Her research interests include human rights, public administration and public policy, modern slavery, and human trafficking. She focuses on the narratives and anti-slavery ideas of survivors of slavery, working closely with government bodies and NGOs on victim support. Andrea?
Thank you, Gamal, and thank you to Mike and Gehan for those brilliant presentations. I think I'll be echoing some of those thoughts. So you might have gathered from Gamal's introduction that my work is slightly different. I gather and analyse survivor narratives from all over the world, but particularly survivors of modern slavery and human trafficking, many of whom are refugees and/or have been displaced by conflict, and many of whom have lost entire communities in the process. So the narratives I gather and analyse are mainly oral narratives, but I have worked with survivors to use photography and art as a means of expression. And it's estimated that there are 40.3 million enslaved today, with many experiences consistent with the conditions of the archetype of 19th century slave trade. And recent research indicates that slavery and trafficking occurs in 90% of recent wars and conflicts through the use of child soldiers, in sexual exploitation, forced marriage, forced labour, and human trafficking of individuals. And by trafficking, I mean the coerced movement, harbouring or receipt of people for their exploitation. And many of these people are unsurprisingly displaced by that conflict or by the enslavement and trafficking they experience. And so those individuals often face violence, physical and psychological suffering, loss of property and livelihood, and the death and scattering of family members, but they also often lose their identity as a result of their experiences, and particularly the kind of generational memory and the community memory that has built up within that community that is then lost. So they can experience a separation from their places and communities of origin, and all these factors basically have an impact on the way they then reformulate, if you like, or have their identities shifted over time, and poses challenges for recovering those. And when analysing the thousands of narratives, survivors don't generally discuss buildings and sites. I'm sure that some people here who will be talking later will work with specific communities where that might come out, but from the narratives that I have access to, it's not something they typically talk about. What they do talk about more is the loss of social, cultural and religious practice, generational memory, language, the loss of names that are specific to their culture, and of artifacts. And a theme running through the narratives is the loss of identity that is linked to that loss of cultural memory, practice and environment. And as Gamal has already noted, we know that heritage is more than just artifacts, buildings and sites. It's about people's memories and how they make sense of their surroundings and history. It's about the accumulated culture of communities, the ideas that bind people together and help shape their sense of identity. So this type of heritage that comes from one generation to the next includes local knowledge and practices, arts, crafts, traditions, faith practices, names and language. And these elements form part of their individual and collective identity and memory, cement social cohesion and provide groups with a sense of continuity, all of which are heavily affected as a result of war, death, displacement, and the associated disruptions to social, economic, and cultural fabric of communities. And in the past few years, a significant amount of cultural heritage has been lost to conflict and other factors, and it has been lost to individuals who have been cut away from their cultural environment, which is why it's important that heritage is seen as more than a witness to civilization, but an integral part of a society's collective memory and being, and to their repatriation and reconciliation. So attacks against heritage and cultural diversity are a recurrent phenomenon in a number of recent armed conflicts, and these attacks, combined with the persecution of minorities, represent a form of cultural cleansing that seeks to destroy the legitimacy of the other to exist as such. But in some cases, the displacement of peoples from their culture and communities creates the other and results in social fragmentation. So individuals are taken away from their environment and what is known and moved to a country, particularly with enslavement, enslaved in another country where the language is different, the culture is different, their religion, their ethnicity is repressed, they are renamed, and so on. So they become othered in being moved out of their environment. And the narrative corpus reveals that the destruction of cultural heritage is perceived by those communities as a direct threat to their memory and to their security. Many not only lose the physical manifestations of their culture, the art, crafts, buildings, sacred locations, and general knowledge that is found in that community and within their families, they also state that they lose their identity, their sense of belonging, and their connection with their ancestors. The destruction of cultural heritage having internal impacts on the individual and generational impacts beyond that also has an impact on the resilience of communities, their ability to reconcile with the past and to establish restoration. And in this context, protecting cultural heritage and integrating the cultural dimension in conflict prevention and resolution becomes a political, humanitarian, and security imperative. And traffickers use a range of tactics to dismantle individuals' cultural identities. So they force them to observe different belief systems, they rename them to divorce them from their culture or faith, they shame and deprecate them from their origins, religion, or ethnicity. So to give an example, survivor Mende Nazir states that during her enslavement, she tried to hide all of her Nuba identity. She didn't speak her Nuba language, she never sang any Nuba songs, and she never ever mentioned her past life. She was ordered not to pray, but she had managed to hide and retain one set of her prayer beads and managed to observe her faith in secret. But when her slaveholder found those beads, he denigrated her, saying they were only worn by savages, and took them away. So attacks by slaveholders on ethnicity, culture, and religious beliefs is used to marginalize, discriminate, dehumanize, and undermine spiritual and cultural identity. And Nazir explained that her treatment basically had completely destroyed her sense of her own identity and her self-worth, and that she was no longer valuable as a human being. And the strategies used to divorce Nazir from her previous identity, to adopt terms that are reminiscent of and create a purposeful association with historic slavery, set the foundations for an understanding of her changed position in the world, and reformulated her knowledge of herself and her place. And that caused huge problems when she managed to escape her situation in trying to recover what she had lost. And the practice of renaming may seem quite innocuous, but names are a means of locating and preserving oneself in a human community, so as to be able to answer the question who, with reference to ancestry, current status, particular bearing, and reference to the full history of time within that culture. And by renaming individuals with names that depart from their culture and origin, or by labeling them literally as slave or outcast, traffickers and slaveholders attempt to undermine pre-enslavement identities. One way in which survivors say they manage to retain their cultural heritage is through the giving of narratives, both textual and visual. And this echoes a bit now what Gerham was saying. The giving of testimony is a means to exteriorize while at the same time naming and validating their subjective experiences. It's essentially a written representation of their belonging and a means of engaging with the expectations of religious and political groups, for example, to create cultural spaces in which the projection of self-representation can take place. Narratives also reveal that retaining or reviving their heritage is important to them in survival and intimately connected to the progression of freedom. And often these will relate to seemingly small changes like the ability to exercise some privacy, to resume some faith practices, the freedom to speak, the right to wear certain clothing, but are intimately related to the things that were denied to them during their enslavement and/or displacement. And survivors' perceptions of the value of freedom are therefore closely tied to the need to reconnect with their identities, faith, and communities, and crucially, how these related to feelings of acceptance. Social belonging is crucial to survivor growth. It decreases feelings of isolation and otherness by enabling social and cultural connection, and reconnecting with or building community is something for survivors to literally to live for, to keep living for. It is also an opportunity to bear witness and an opportunity for existence. So as one survivor stated, they said, "I feel as if I've nothing left to be alive for. I have no family, it's just me. No one will be able to tell stories about my childhood." For others, community is a way of choosing a family of their own creation, either replacing families lost or building families anew where their families were actually the abusers or traffickers. However, many experience difficulty with this reconnection. In many cases, entire communities and locations have been lost, and the nature of the country itself may have changed, and many survivors express difficulties integrating with new communities where they have felt cut off from their culture and don't carry the protections afforded to them previously when they were known in their communities. And if survivors have been removed from their communities and are able to return, family members and survivors often don't know each other anymore, and survivors' experiences have altered who they are and how they behave, with families having to learn the facets of a very different person than the one remembered, and where in many cases survivors will have adopted a range of different behaviours or different cultural and social practices, or perhaps where a family believes that their relative had actually died and now returns. And survivors say that they feel broken and foreign. One survivor said, "When I went back in June, I was really happy to see my parents, but then I felt like I was disconnected. I felt like an alien in my own country because I don't feel any connection. Everybody's grown and married and everybody has moved on." So reconnecting also causes an unexpected confrontation with aspects of their trauma. Ishmael Beyer, a former child soldier, discusses his uncle calling him son and is slightly bemused by this. He expresses that he's worried about living with what he calls a new family, even though he's living with his relatives. He'd been on his own for so many years and taken care of himself without any support or guidance that he was afraid that if he distanced himself from his family unit, he would be seen as ungrateful and they wouldn't continue to take him in. And he was also worried about how he was going to explain the sadness that he was unable to hide. Beyond the immediate impact of family relations, survivors also lose their connection with the wider community and its heritage as a whole, feeling alienated from it. And echoing Mike's discussion of community-centred initiatives, measures by which some of these issues are successfully mitigated are through initiatives that restore shared cultural heritage, but particularly through survivor and community participation that incorporate one or several elements, such as education, business, storytelling, art and craft, and museums, and through the rebuilding of lost community buildings and sites of importance. And that survivor participation has proven to be particularly valuable where it comes to trying to recover. Another way in which this is achieved is through the building of communities of survivors. It's an effective means of creating or positioning themselves in an accepting community, and has been shown to be invaluable to recovery. The survivor Rachel Lloyd states that one of the most critical things for her was being around other girls and women who'd experienced the life that became the place where she felt most normal. And they shared a common understanding, remembered similar feelings, and could talk frankly about their experiences without judgment. And those things made her feel less of a round peg in a square world, to use her words. So I've briefly mentioned the role of narratives in addressing some of these issues and as a means of growth and recovering of cultural memory. And narratives also have documentary status, providing key testimony and adding representative, often excluded voices to the discourse on slavery. Every successful social movement has been guided by those directly affected by the injustice, who are best positioned to determine appropriate strategies and offer visionary solutions. And where public awareness can help to drive approaches to abolition or to reparation, the stories told by those who have experienced slavery and displacement and other forms of human rights and humanitarian wrongs are important awareness-raising accounts, unmasking the abuses that have occurred and those that continue to play out today. And the thousands of survivor narratives collected were key, for example, to the South African Truth and Reconciliation Commission's evidentiary work, helping to bring about a reconciliation of its people by uncovering the truth about human rights violations through those narratives, those testimonies of people who had experienced the violations that had occurred during the period of apartheid. And so narratives not only have a value to the individual, they also have, and to the community, they also have a value where it comes to reparation and reconciliation. They can be intensely political documents. They can contribute to debates, to democratization, to perspectives on freedom, and they can challenge ideologies and essentially are an act of open rebellion, can be a declaration of their right to speak and mirror social change. In longer narratives, survivors can explore their memories without the need to tell linear or chronological stories, and can be freed of the constraints of having to only tell the facts. And with the opportunity for longer narratives, two important aims are brought together: narratives told for the self, and to make survivors' experiences known to a wider audience, to be utilised, to recreate what was lost, and to build a sense of shared history. Part of the journey for survivors in recovery is in retelling, and survivor stories have an important place in driving strategies for survivor growth. The giving of testimony can act as a form of rehabilitation, providing the survivor with a feeling of purpose, agency, and identity, and facilitate the grieving process, providing an opportunity to grow and move forward. So narratives essentially reveal the possibility of addressing the tension between the legal policy and prosecutorial aims of movements on one hand, and the therapeutic aims of movements on the other. So reading people's life stories, engaging with the detail and the complexity of these narratives is to place their experiences in our consciousness and ask us to attend to the meaning and effect of those experiences. And the material of the lived, recalled and surrendered past puts memory to use, both as a technique and a subject. And through the detail of their telling, survivors' experiences are made visceral and connected to our own world. They compel our empathy, drawing out our own emotional memories of grief, loss, pain, humiliation, discrimination, and abuse. They force us to understand their experiences as more than a summary of something we have read on the news or a type, and practices that are so easily abstracted or far removed from our own experiences. They can become powerful writings that represent some of the most important subjective expositions of what it means to be displaced and exploited today, and they enable survivors to be fully heard, often for the first time, to explore their own feelings and memories, to choose what to reveal or conceal, and to identify themselves as more than just victims, but to recover their identity and the cultural heritage that is intimately bound up with it and which may have been eroded in their severing from their environment. Survivors express that the giving of narrative holds measurable value for them, providing a means for them to locate their rights-based voice, rebuild communities, and provide the ability to craft or recraft their identities, and so to reclaim some of what was lost. So I hope in this presentation I've managed to convince a few of you of the value of narratives to the process. Thank you.